At my son's parent-teacher conference, my ex declared, "She's an unfit mother. Look at her job." The principal nodded. Then I handed them my credentials. I wasn't a waitress anymore. I was the new school superintendent. The smell of stale coffee and industrial-grade hand sanitizer in the principal's office was a sensory trigger that usually induced a mild fight or flight response in most parents. But as I sat in the beige, upholstered chair at exactly 2:14 p.m. on Tuesday, November 14th, my heart rate was resting comfortably at 62 beats per minute. Across the scratched mahogany desk sat Dr. Anthony, a man who had been the principal of Oak Creek Elementary for 12 years and who wore his complacency like a badge of honor. To my left sat Marcus, my ex-husband of 3 years, wearing a navy bespoke suit that I knew cost $2,400 because I was the one who had balanced our checkbook when he bought it 5 years ago, back when I was still useful. Marcus was checking his Rolex, a Submariner he had purchased immediately after his first bonus check as lead anesthesiologist at Mercy General, signaling to everyone in the room that his time was worth roughly $450 an hour, and we were currently wasting it. We were gathered here ostensibly to discuss our 7-year-old son Leo's recent behavioral regression, a term Marcus had weaponized in his latest motion for full custody. But the air in the room wasn't heavy with concern for a child. It was heavy with the specific, suffocating arrogance of two men who believed they were the only adults in the room. Dr. Aris cleared his throat, shuffling a file that I noticed was disturbingly thin for a student who had been in the district since kindergarten. Miss Davis, Aris began, correcting himself with a patronizing smile that didn't reach his eyes. We called this meeting because Leo has been acting out. He's been lethargic, distracted, and frankly, his homework completion rate has dropped by 15% in the last grading period. Marcus leaned forward, clasping his hands, surgeon's hands, clean, manicured, and utterly devoid of warmth. "It's the environment, Anthony," Marcus said, addressing the principal by his first name to establish their peerage. "I've told the court this repeatedly. Elena is working double shifts at that diner. She's exhausted. She's dragging Leo there after school because she can't afford childcare. The boy is doing his math homework on a grease-stained counter while she serves burgers to truckers. It's not a stable environment for a developing mind." Dr. Aris nodded gravely, tapping his pen against the desk. "I have to agree, Marcus. Stability is key at this age. And if the mother's employment situation is fluctuating, it creates chaos." He turned to me, his face arranging itself into a mask of faux sympathy. "Elena, we all appreciate hard work, but perhaps Marcus is right. If you can't provide a structured home environment because of your job, maybe it's time to rethink the custody arrangement. For Leo's sake, she's an unfit mother. Look at her job. It's not a career. It's a survival tactic." The silence that followed was intended to shame me. It was intended to make me look at my sensible, off-the-rack blazer and feel small. They expected the waitress. They expected the woman who smelled like fryer oil and desperation. They didn't know that the woman sitting in front of them had spent the last 4 years sleeping 3 hours a night to rewrite the architecture of her life. To understand why I didn't crumble, why I didn't cry or beg as I had in the courtroom 3 years ago, you have to understand the trajectory of the crash. I met Marcus when I was 22, and he was a first-year medical student drowning in $180,000 of debt. I was waiting tables at a high-end steakhouse downtown, pulling in $45,000 a year in cash tips. I was the bank. I paid the rent. I paid for the groceries. I paid for the textbooks. I put my own dreams of a master's degree on hold because we needed to focus on his career. "Once I'm an attending," he used to say, kissing my forehead as I left for a night shift, "it'll be your turn, Elle. I promise." I believed him. I was young, in love, and naive enough to think that sacrifice was a currency that gathered interest. It doesn't. It depreciates the moment you hand it over. 7 years later, he was the chief of anesthesiology, making $550,000 a year, and I was the uneducated wife who didn't fit in at the hospital galas. The discard was brutal. He met a 24-year-old nurse named Jessica, who looked at him with adoration instead of the exhaustion I carried. He filed for divorce on a Friday. By Monday, he had frozen the joint accounts. Because we had never married legally, a philosophical choice he insisted on, which I now realize was a strategic asset protection move. I was left with nothing but a used Toyota Camry and a rental deposit I had to borrow from my mother. The custody battle was a massacre. His lawyer, a shark who charged $600 an hour, painted me as transient and financially unstable. "She has no career," the lawyer argued. "She has a job. There is a difference." The judge, a tired man who looked at tax returns rather than character, gave Marcus 70% custody. I got weekends. I got to see my son every other Friday to Sunday. It broke me. For 6 months, I was exactly what they said I was, a waitress trying to survive. I went back to the diner because it was the only cash flow I could generate instantly. But grief is a strange fuel. If you don't let it burn you down, it turns into a cold, hard engine. One night, after dropping Leo off at Marcus's sprawling modernist mansion, watching my son walk into a house that was cleaner than a museum and colder than a morgue, I made a decision. I wasn't going to fight Marcus with emotions. I was going to fight him with credentials. I enrolled in an accelerated online doctoral program in educational leadership. I didn't tell anyone. Not my mother, not my friends, and certainly not Marcus. I worked the morning shift at the diner from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. I picked Leo up from school on my days, played with him him, fed him, and loved him. And from 9 p.m. to 3 a.m., every single night for 3 years, I studied. I wrote papers on systemic inequities in public school funding. I wrote a dissertation titled Administrative Accountability, Reforming the Top-Down Failure in District Management. I lived on caffeine and spite. It was grueling. I missed movies. I missed dates. I missed sleep. But I had a vision. I knew that Marcus respected only one thing: authority. And in his world, authority was defined by titles and income. I graduated with my Ed.D. 6 months ago, summa cum laude. But a degree is just paper. I needed the position. I applied for administrative roles in neighboring districts, landing a job as an assistant superintendent 2 counties over. I kept my head down. I commuted 2 hours a day so no one in our town would know. I kept working 1 shift a weekend at the diner just to keep the struggling waitress narrative alive for Marcus. It was camouflage. As long as he thought I was weak, he wouldn't look for the knife. Then, 2 months ago, the superintendency for District 42, our district, Marcus's district, opened up. The previous superintendent had retired amid a scandal involving misappropriated sports funds. The school board wanted an outsider. They wanted a reformer. They wanted someone who understood the granular economics of education, but had the backbone to cut administrative bloat. I applied. The interview process was intense. 5 rounds, a presentation to the board, a vetting of my financials, a background check that went back 10 years. I sat in front of the 7 board members, men and women who controlled the education of 15,000 students, and I laid out my plan. I spoke about the failure of the current administration to support vulnerable students. I spoke about principals who were more concerned with donor relations than curriculum adherence. I didn't mention names, but I described Dr. Harris's leadership style with surgical accuracy. They hired me. The contract was finalized yesterday. My start date was technically next Monday, but the paperwork was signed, sealed, and filed with the state. My salary was set at $185,000 a year, plus a vehicle allowance, plus full benefits. It wasn't Marcus money, but it was power. It was the power to fire the man sitting across from me. It was the power to rewrite the policy that Marcus was currently using to bully me. But they didn't know. To them, I was still the woman who refilled coffee cups. Marcus leaned back in his chair, checking his watch again. "Look, we're running in circles," he said, his voice dripping with boredom. "Elena, be reasonable. Sign the modification. Let me take Leo during the week. Jessica can help him with his homework. She's educated. She has her BSN. She can provide the academic support you clearly can't." The insult landed softly, like a practiced blow. Jessica, the nurse. Jessica, who was 27 now and posting photos of her boys on Instagram. Dr. Harris nodded in agreement. "It does seem like the logical solution, Elena. We can't have Leo falling behind because of logistical deficits at home. I can have the school counselor draw up a recommendation for the court if you like. It would carry significant weight." That was the trap. A letter from the school principal stating that the mother's home environment was detrimental to the child's education. In family court, that was a nuclear weapon. Marcus had orchestrated this perfectly. He had likely donated to the school's new computer lab fund, a tax-deductible $5,000 just to grease the wheels for this meeting. It was corruption wrapped in concern. I looked at Dr. Harris. I looked at the coffee stain on his tie. I looked at the way he deferred to Marcus, a man who had no pedagogical training, simply because he wore a stethoscope and a Rolex. I reached down to the floor where my tote bag sat. It was a cheap canvas bag from Trader Joe's, part of the costume. Inside, however, was a slim red leather portfolio. I pulled it out. The sound of the leather sliding against the canvas was the only noise in the room. I placed it on the desk, right on top of the thin file Dr. Harris had been ignoring. "I understand your concerns, gentlemen," I said. My voice was different. I dropped the soft, apologetic tone I used at the diner. I used my boardroom voice, the pitch I had perfected during my defense dissertation. It was an octave lower, steady, devoid of upspeak. "You are worried about competence. You are worried about qualifications. You are worried about the leadership modeling Leo is receiving." Marcus frowned, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. He hadn't heard me speak like that in years. "Elena, don't start with the speeches. We're talking about reality." "So am I said. I opened the portfolio. "Dr. Harris, you mentioned that my job makes me unfit. You mentioned that a waitress cannot possibly understand the academic needs of a second grader." I slid the first document across the desk. It was a photocopy of my doctoral diploma from the University of Pennsylvania. Doctor of Education. I read aloud, "Specialization in Administrative Reform and Policy." Marcus scoffed. "What is this? Some online certificate? Did you print this off the internet?" "It's an accredited doctorate, Marcus. Feel free to check the clearinghouse. But that's just the education. Let's talk about the job." I slid the second document across. This one was heavy. It was 20 pages, stapled, with the District 42 seal embossed in gold at the top. It was my employment contract. "This," I said, pointing to the signature line at the bottom of the first page, "is my new job description. Start date, November 20th. Dr. Harris looked at the document. He squinted. Then his eyes went wide. He looked at the letterhead. He looked at the salary. He looked at the title. Superintendent of Schools, District 42. He looked at me. The color drained from his face in a way that was scientifically fascinating. This says," he stammered. "It says you're the superintendent, the new superintendent." I corrected him. "Your boss, your direct superior, the person who signs off on your budget, your staffing, and your contract renewal, which I believe is up for review in June." Marcus snatched snatched the paper from Eris's hand. He scanned it, his eyes darting frantically. "This is bullshit," he spat. "You, the superintendent? You served me a Cobb salad 3 weeks ago." "I did," I replied calmly, "and you tipped me 10%, which was stingy, considering the service was excellent. But yes, Marcus, I was working 2 jobs, one to pay for the lawyer to fight you, and one to build the career that would bury you." I stood up. I didn't rush. I smoothed the lapel of my cheap blazer, which suddenly didn't feel cheap anymore. It felt like the uniform of the victor. "Dr. Eris," I said, turning my gaze to the principal, who was now sweating profusely. "I find it interesting that you are so quick to judge the parenting capacity of a service worker. It suggests a bias that is incompatible with the inclusive values of District 42. I think we need to have a very long, very detailed conversation about your performance reviews. And let's start with the fact that you allowed a non-guardian, my ex-husband's girlfriend, to pick up my son from school last Thursday without my authorization. That's a FERPA violation, Anthony, and a liability nightmare." Eris looked like he was going to vomit. "Mrs. Davis, Superintendent Davis, I had no idea," Marcus told me. "Marcus is a parent." I cut him off. "He has no administrative authority here." "I do." "Now, regarding Leo." I leaned over the desk, invading his space just enough to assert dominance. "There will be no letter to the court. There will be no recommendation for custody modification. Instead, you are going to put Leo on a personalized support plan for high-potential students dealing with divorce trauma. You are going to assign him to Miss Holloway for reading, because she is the best teacher in this building, not the one Marcus likes because she flirts with him. And you are going to email me a weekly report on his progress, directly to me. Do we understand each other?" Eris nodded so hard his glasses slipped down his nose. Yes, absolutely. "Whatever you say, Superintendent." I turned to Marcus. He was still holding the contract, staring at it as if it were a poisonous snake. He looked at me, and for the first time in 7 years, I saw fear. He realized that the dynamic had shifted. He realized that money was no longer the only currency in the room. He realized that while he was playing checkers with his checkbook, I had been playing 4D chess with his entire world. "You can't do this," he whispered. "I'm a donor, and I'm the administration." I smiled. "I'll be reviewing the donor perks policy next week. I have a feeling we're going to find some ethical conflicts." I grabbed my tote bag. "I'm taking Leo home now. It's my afternoon. And Marcus, if you ever insult my work ethic in front of my son again, I won't just take you to family court. I'll audit the hospital's partnership with the district's nursing program. I hear the accreditation renewal is coming up. It would be a shame if someone found out about the irregularities." I walked to the door. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could hear the silence behind me, and it was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a hierarchy collapsing. It was the sound of the unfit mother taking the throne. But the battle wasn't over. This was just the opening salvo. Marcus was a narcissist, and narcissists don't retreat. They escalate. I knew he would call his lawyer the second I left the building. I knew he would try to find a loophole, a scandal, anything to discredit me before I officially took office. But he didn't know about the second binder, the one I had left in the car, the one that contained the evidence I had gathered during my dissertation research, evidence that linked Marcus's generous donations to a vendor kickback scheme involving the school's cafeteria supplier. I walked out into the bright November sunlight, the crisp air filling my lungs. I walked to the playground where Leo was waiting. He was sitting on a bench, looking small and sad. When he saw me, his face lit up. "Mom!" he yelled, running toward me. I caught him, swinging him up into my arms. He smelled like sweat and crayons and life. "Did you talk to the principal?" he asked, burying his face in my neck. "I did, baby," I said, kissing his hair. "Is everything okay?" "Everything is going to be different," I promised him. "Mommy got a promotion." As I strapped him into the car, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Marcus. "This isn't over. You're playing a dangerous game." I typed back 2 words, "Checkmate, Marcus." Then I blocked him for the rest of the day. I had a district to run, and I had a son to raise. The waitress was dead. Long live the superintendent. The Monday morning I took office as superintendent of District 42. The sky was a bruised shade of purple, threatening a winter storm that mirrored the turbulence waiting for me inside the administrative building. And as I walked past the receptionist, a woman named Beverly, heavy with skepticism, who had known me previously only as the mother who sometimes forgot to sign permission slips, I felt the weight of the master keycard in my pocket like a physical anchor grounding me to my new reality. It was November 20th, 8 a.m. sharp, and my office was spacious, smelling of lemon polish and the stale ambition of my predecessor, but I didn't spend time arranging photos or choosing a font for my nameplate because I spent the first hour locking down the digital perimeter by calling IT and having them revoke Dr. Eris's administrative access to the central budget server before he could purge his emails. Then I called for the forensic audit, not a standard review but a surgical strike, hiring an external firm called KPMG and Associates, and specifically requesting a lead auditor named Sarah Jenkins, a woman I had met during my doctoral research who could spot a floating decimal point from a mile away and who charged a retainer of $15,000, a line item I approved under emergency administrative oversight, knowing it would pay for itself tenfold. Marcus didn't wait long to retaliate because at 10:15 a.m., my secretary buzzed me, her voice trembling, to say there was a process server there and that Dr. Eris was on line 1 shouting about a union grievance, so I took the papers first, which turned out to be an emergency injunction filed in family court, claiming that I had obtained my employment employment through fraudulent misrepresentation and that my new schedule would irreparably harm Leo's stability. Marcus was trying to get a judge to force me to quit or lose custody. A weak legal argument since employment fraud is a civil issue, not a family court one, but it was designed to bleed me and keep me distracted, defending my title, instead of looking at the books, so I handed the papers to my new assistant and told her to file them with my personal attorney while instructing her to tell Dr. Aris that if he raised his voice at district staff again, I would place him on administrative leave for conduct unbecoming a principal before he could finish his sentence. The investigation took 3 weeks of grueling, eye-straining work where I lived in the basement of the records department, cross-referencing invoices, while Marcus postured at the hospital, telling anyone who would listen that I was a glorified lunch lady who slept her way into a title, a mathematically impossible rumor given my work schedule. But we found the anomaly on December 5th, buried deep in the nutrition services budget. For the last 4 years, District 42 had been contracting its school lunches through a company called Nutri Health Solutions, with a contract valued at $1.2 million annually. And on paper, it looked legitimate, promising organic, locally sourced meals. But when I looked at the actual delivery manifests, the food wasn't coming from local farms, but from a generic wholesale depot 3 counties over, the same depot that supplied the state prison system. The district was paying $4.50 per meal for food that cost $0.85 to produce, meaning the difference, roughly $3.65 per student per day, was evaporating into the ether, and Sarah found the wire transfers confirming that Nutri Health Solutions was a shell company registered in Delaware with its primary shareholder listed as a holding company called Esculapian Ventures. I ran a search on Esculapian, finding the registered agent was a lawyer in the Cayman Islands, but the initial incorporation documents, which had been carelessly digitized in 2019, listed 3 board members: the former superintendent, the owner of the wholesale depot, and Dr. Marcus Thorne. My ex-husband wasn't just a donor, he was a vendor, profiting off the very grease-stained homework environment he mocked, feeding Leo unmatched grade meat and charging the taxpayers for filet mignon, then using the profits to pay the lawyer who was trying to take Leo away from me. The rage I felt wasn't hot, it was absolute zero, the clarity of a diamond cutter finding the cleavage point, so I didn't call the police immediately, because I needed the kill shot to be public, to dismantle his reputation so thoroughly that he couldn't operate in this town again. The monthly school board meeting was scheduled for December 14th, and I knew Marcus would be there to make his move. The auditorium was packed that night because Marcus had rallied his troops, ensuring there were parents there holding signs that read, "Experience matters" and "Protect our standards," vague slogans that were dog whistles for "Get the waitress out." And Marcus sat in the front row looking smug in a cashmere coat, flanked by Dr. Aris and a few other administrators who were part of the old boys club, all thinking this was my trial, where the board would bow to public pressure and rescind my contract. The board president, a nervous man named Mr. Henderson who ran a car dealership, opened the floor for public comment, and Marcus stood up immediately, walking to the microphone and adjusting it with that practiced surgical precision before beginning his speech about facing a crisis of confidence and handing the reins of a $50 million organization to a woman whose primary qualification until last month was asking if people wanted fries with their order. The room erupted in cruel, sharp laughter as he continued to say he was all for self-improvement, but that we could not gamble our children's future on a social experiment, formally requesting a vote of no confidence in Superintendent Davis before sitting down to thunderous applause while Eris smirked at me from the second row. I stood up and walked to the podium wearing a severe, tailored black suit that I had bought with my first paycheck, and I didn't bring notes. I brought the binder, 3 inches thick, red, and labeled Nutri Health Audit, FY 2020 to 2024, placing it on the lectern with a thud that echoed through the room. Dr. Thorne raises an excellent point about confidence, I said, my voice projected clearly using the boardroom voice to silence the murmurs, because the community deserves to know exactly where their tax dollars are going and why, despite a 15% increase in the nutrition budget, our students are being served meals that fail to meet the state's minimum nutritional density standards. I opened the binder and commanded the AV technician to show slide 1, which lit up the screen behind me with a side-by-side comparison of a Nutri Health invoice and a delivery manifest, showing that on October 12th, the district paid $14,500 for free-range poultry, while the delivery manifest showed we received 2,000 pounds of processed chicken product from a discount liquidation center, a markup of 400%. The room went quiet, the parents stopped rustling their signs, and I moved to slide 2, showing the corporate structure of Nutri Health Solutions leading to Esculapian Ventures before moving to slide 3, looking directly at Marcus as his name appeared on the screen in 40-point font right next to his signature as a beneficiary. The gasps were audible, and Marcus stood up, his face flushing a violent shade of red, shouting that it was a fabrication and a violation of privacy, accusing me of hacking his records, but I replied with an icy calm that these were public records, or would be if he hadn't tried to hide them in the Caymans, pointing out that he made a mistake mistake by paying the annual filing fee from his personal checking account in 2021, the same account he used to pay my alimony, or rather the alimony he stopped paying 3 months ago. I turned to the board and stated that Dr. Thorne wasn't a concerned citizen, but a vendor who had embezzled approximately $450,000 from the district over the last 4 years, using the school lunch program as his personal piggy bank, and that Dr. Eris had signed off on every single fraudulent invoice, citing the emails I found where Eris asked for his consulting fee to be expedited. I turned back to the microphone and announced that I had already forwarded the file to the State Attorney General and the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, who were waiting in the lobby, and as if on cue, the double doors at the back of the auditorium opened, and 4 agents in windbreakers marked FBI entered, not for the show but for the suspects. The room erupted into chaos, not of mockery but of justice, as I watched agents approach Marcus, who tried to pull away, shouting about his lawyers and his status, but the handcuffs clicked just the same, and Dr. Eris was weeping openly as he was led out while I stood at the podium watching them go, closing the binder without smiling or gloating. The board members were staring at me with a mixture of terror and awe, Mr. Henderson squeaking that they had no idea, to which I replied that I knew, and that was why they hired me to clean up the mess before adjourning the meeting. The legal fallout was catastrophic for Marcus because the FBI charged him with wire fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and theft of government funds, charges that carried mandatory minimums since the lunch program received federal subsidies. His assets were frozen immediately, and the hospital board fired him within 48 hours, citing the moral turpitude clause in his contract, transforming him from chief of anesthesiology to federal defendant in the span of a week. The custody battle ended not with a bang, but with a whisper, because with Marcus facing indictment and having no income, his high-priced lawyer withdrew, leaving him to represent himself at the emergency hearing. I requested where he looked haggard in a tracksuit because his suits had been seized. The judge, a woman who had no patience for white-collar theft, granted me full legal and physical custody, noting that his concern for the child's environment seemed selective, given he was poisoning the institution his son attended, to line his pockets, and suspended visitation pending the outcome of his criminal trial. I walked out of that courtroom holding the order that gave me my son back fully and completely, not looking at Marcus, who had become a ghost in his own life. 5 years have passed since that night, and I am still the superintendent of District 42, which is now ranked in the top 5% of the state, and we have a new lunch program that is actually locally sourced and run by a cooperative of parents, the invoices for which I check personally every month. Leo is 12 now, thriving, playing soccer and the cello, and knowing that his mother is the boss, and while he doesn't remember the unfit years, he knows the strength that came from them. Marcus took a plea deal and served 3 years in a federal camp, losing his medical license, and I heard he manages a car rental branch in Ohio now, sending Leo a card on his birthday which I let Leo read because I don't hide the truth that people can be complex and broken. Last week, I was invited to speak at the State Education Conference on the topic of resilience in administration, and as I stood on the stage, looking out at a sea of educators, I saw Dr. Eris in the back row working as a janitor for the convention center, pushing a broom. He saw me, stopped, looked at the Chanel blazer I was wearing, which I bought with my own money, looked at the slide behind me listing my accomplishments, and didn't wave, just looked down and kept sweeping. I paused my speech for a second, remembering the smell of fryer oil, the ache in my feet, and the desperation of counting tips to buy milk, realizing the waitress wasn't dead, but was the one who built this and sharpened the knife. I told the crowd that leadership is not about the title you hold, but about what you are willing to endure to protect the integrity of the work, and that the only person who can define your value is you. The applause was loud, but the silence inside me was louder, the silence of a debt paid in full, of a house that belongs to me, a child who is safe, and a future that is unwritten. So I took a sip of water, smiled, and continued the presentation because the numbers, after all, never lie.